Greetings, fellow painters! Today, as we paint up Mysterio for the Marvel Zombies board game, we're going to paint the demonic crystal ball that is Mysterio's melon. We're going to create the illusion that there is a milky, ethereal substance behind the glass of his helmet, while also making it appear that there are some bright reflections on the surface of the helmet. We'll explore the use of glazes and a couple of thick varnishes while we accomplish this. I'll demonstrate painting the entire character model in this video, so if you'd like, you can jump straight to painting the helmet using the timestamp down below. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. While you can see that I painted the smoky area first, which I did for my white oil wash versus acrylic wash video, we're going to take a more sane approach here and recommend painting the base of the miniature as a final step. Starting with the miniature that has been primed in black, I'm going to begin painting the cloak with Dark Plum by Monument Hobbies. I have the paint thinned down a little bit with water and I'm applying it to the entire cape. I thinned the paint because I want it to dry somewhat translucent and appear very dark. This will be the darkest shadow color in the deepest recesses, and this is the only coat of paint that the darkest shadows will receive. While applying this initial layer over the black primer, I'm taken aback by just how much brighter the paint looks here than it does in the bottle. Because I have already painted the smoky area on the base, I spend a lot of time painting this miniature upside down to avoid screwing up any of my previous work. This is the main reason I would suggest painting the smoke last. While the brightness of the initial application of Dark Plum surprised me, I was equally surprised by just how dark it had dried when it came time to apply the second coat. This is more along the lines of the color that I was expecting, and I'm happy that I stuck with it. It is typical for acrylic paints to look quite a bit brighter when wet than when dry, but the disparity of brightness with this particular color seemed really dramatic to me. I proceed with applying a second coat to the cape, avoiding putting paint in the deep recesses and areas that I want to remain the darkest. This layer of paint will go on faster than the first because we don't have to worry about getting into all of those hard to reach places this time. For the first level of highlights, we'll use a 50-50 mix of the Dark Plum and Magenta by Monument Hobbies. We'll cover about 90% of the raised parts of the cape. Even though the magenta is pretty bright, this mix will still dry fairly dark and make a nice transition from the pure Dark Plum. This will be done in 2 coats to make sure that the intensity of color builds on itself. We still have a few more highlight steps after this, so we don't have to be too careful with the direction of our strokes. We're laying the foundation for our highlights. With each additional layer of paint we add, we'll cover less and less territory. The next level of highlights will consist of just pure magenta paint. Now I'm being mindful of my strokes and applying the paint in such a way as to start creating some texture. I'm also drawing my strokes towards the light source or an edge, finishing each stroke at a point that I want to be the brightest. This will help sell the idea that the fabric is interacting with a light source. Once the magenta highlights are where I want them, I will use a thinned mixture of this magenta along with a little of the previous magenta and Dark Plum mix, and apply it as a glaze to smooth the transitions between layers. It may seem here that I'm killing the shadow colors, but this mix is about 50% water, so it will dry very translucent. It'll have a subtle impact on the colors that I've already put down, but work nicely to unify the different layers. I then go back in with the pure magenta and brighten the center of the previously highlighted areas. I'll further the intensity of the highlights with a mix of magenta and ice yellow. I apply this highlight with a fine tip brush and I use short strokes across the width of the existing highlighted areas, rather than drawing the stroke along the length of the highlight. This is an easy trick to use to make it appear that light is bouncing off the fabric rather than it looking like there is a painted stripe down the length of the fold in the cape. Once I've hit a small portion of each raised area with this mix, I'll switch to pure ice yellow to dot in some final highlights. With this, I am mostly just focusing on edges, folds around the head and upper torso, and I'll apply some to the one prominent fold on the lower front part of the cape. And that wraps up the cape. I decided to take a very basic approach to painting the bodysuit. I'm using flat green by Vallejo as the base color. I remove the excess paint from the brush and using the side of the brush, I drag it across Mysterio's clothing. The suit is made up of a bunch of raised nubs in a grid pattern, so the paint sticks easily to all of the raised bits, much like dry brushing would. I had considered many approaches to painting this suit, including dry brushing, using a solid base coat with an oil wash after, and I even considered speed paints. I decided on this method as a neater alternative to dry brushing that would leave the grid pattern on his suit nice and dark without having to add a wash to it afterward. I'm pleasantly surprised with how easy and smooth this process went. Mysterio's gloves, bracers, and boots all get a coat of this color as well. The initial highlights are achieved by adding some demonic yellow to the flat green. I'm using the same approach to apply the paint, where I use the side of the brush to add highlights to all of the raised muscles. I'll also use this color on the top center of each boot and highlight the bracers and gloves. Ice Yellow by Vallejo is used to add the final highlights. I'm stippling these highlights around the upper chest and shoulders, as well as along the edge highlights to the bracers and the top of the boots. The helmet is a showpiece for this miniature, and I want it to be a swirl of purples and blues. I start with a base coat of Alien Purple by the Army Painter. Throughout the process of painting the helmet, I'm not worried about getting complete coverage with any one coat. I'm going to work through purples and blues in many layers with random lines, some wet blending, and some glazing, which is really just a fancy way of saying that I'm going to take a haphazard approach to painting this helmet. Next, I'm working in some purple by Vallejo, and with this color, I'm going to cover most of the Alien Purple base only because I don't want the helmet to appear too dark when I'm all done, but I do want some dark bits here and there. I use Glacier Blue Game Color to sketch in the main reflections on the helmet as demonstrated here. However, I do go back and change the angle of the long bottom reflection later. Then I use some Steel Gray Game Color and begin adding erratic lines and swirls all around the helmet. I'm actually envisioning the look of the gas giant Jupiter as I paint this helmet, even though it is a completely different color scheme. I also use some purple by Vallejo to cover up the long reflection on the bottom of the helmet. Then I go back to the Glacier Blue and correct the angle of the bottom reflection, as well as add some ring reflections around the small dot on the top of the helmet. I'm trying to mimic something like a lens flare reflection with these highlights. Finally, I go around the helmet glazing in some of the purple and some of the steel gray. The steel gray in particular is a very thin glaze and is done just to sort of unify the colors of the helmet to make it look like all of the colors are swirling around each other inside the helmet. I initially decided to go with a gloss varnish to make the helmet look like it was shiny glass. However, this did not work as a final varnish because it interacts too much with the normal ambient light and completely defeats the effect of the painted reflections. So I used a matte varnish over the top of this. I still think that there is some benefit to applying the gloss varnish first to make it appear that the colors of the helmet are behind glass rather than painted on the surface. I think that the choice to go with the gloss varnish is a fine one if you aren't already painting on your own reflections, as it will interact with normal room lighting. Painted reflections, much like non-metallic metal, look great in static photos, but lose their effect when handled or moved around. That's because the reflections don't change in response to the movement. I'm using a mix of bright red and amethyst metallic craft paint to very simply and quickly paint the medallions on Mysterio's cape. I'm accomplishing this with just a couple of coats of dry brushing. The hose clamp that keeps Mysterio's helmet in place is painted equally quickly by applying desert yellow as an edge highlight to all of the raised areas, which are over a chocolate brown base coat. Then, demonic yellow is added as edge highlights to the upward facing areas, followed by dotting in some ice yellow for some final glints of light. To paint the green smoke, be sure to check out this video here where I present two different approaches to painting the glowing green smoke. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.